Has a lot of people heard of him?
Yeah. I'm not going to go through all the history because, and God knows we're going to come up with we're going to talk about a lot more of his albums later on because the dude was the man.
Are all of his albums on this list? Because he's pretty famous. So.
Well, the other thing about Dylan is he's got a lot of terrible stuff, and but what he's most famous for was actually pretty much. You could make the argument that what he's most famous for was every album that led up to this one. You know, this was the album that he started to kind of diverge a little bit away from the iconic, songs and anthems and influence that he was really, had up until that point. He started off in the early, I think 62 was his first album, and he did like a slew of 4 albums from like 62 to 64. Which is just very, that's what a lot of artists did back in the day. They just put out 2 albums a year, and it was very different than what it is today. But those albums had things like Hard Rain's Gonna Fall, Times Are A-Changin', and a lot of these, socio-political songs that, that people later dubbed, baby boomers saying, this is the voice of our generation, and he was a hero. He, stood out in the counterculture and, hung out with other folkies like, Pete Seeger and Joan Baez, who were very much in protest. Protest was a very big part of what they were doing. And then in 1965, he decides to go electric and starts, incorporating electric, blues rock into his music, and, subsequently finds himself getting booed off stage by the, by the folkies who, thought that he was betraying them. This was their hero, and there was 2 different camps there. There were the folkies and there were the rockers, and they didn't really take too kindly to Dylan going electric. So there's all kinds of stories with that. But this album kind of comes off of this is his 8th studio album that was released on December 27th, 1967. So it was the tail end of 1967. But what happened? He was basically touring. He was getting exhausted from all the touring that he was doing from, Blonde on Blonde and Highway 61 Revisited, those electric albums. And then on July 29th, 1966, he crashed his motorcycle near his home in Woodstock, New York, and was thrown to the ground. And although it's kind of weird because you try to look this up and you try to find out exactly what happened, the extent of his injuries, but there's not a lot of records of that. So there's still, in very Dylan fashion, there's a lot of mystery surrounding, events of his life, and this being one of them. But it was a pretty serious, from the accounts, it was a pretty serious accident. Dylan later claimed that he broke a couple of vertebrae in his neck, which sounds like that should have killed him. I mean, I'm not a doctor, but if you break your neck, shouldn't you die? I kind of think that's what happens when you get when you get hanged. But anyway, so he basically gets in this this motorcycle accident, and then he just falls off the face of the earth. He kind of just he goes in seclusion. He kind of does some music with, eventually gets together with members of his band, the Hawks, which eventually became the band. And they, record some songs in Woodstock, but he finally got some guys together,
the Basement Tapes too.
That was the Basement Tapes. Yeah. And this album came out right around the time that the Basement Tapes. So this music was all recorded around the same time. And I guess there's some dispute over what was done first. Mm-hmm. So we're not exactly sure what was recorded. I mean, the Basement Tapes were kind of a bootlegged, kind of thing that wasn't available to the masses for many, many years. But it was always kind of this thing like, hey, Dylan recorded a bunch of music with the band, with the Hawks. But this album was not any members of the band. It was just 3 other guys that I never heard of. Charlie McCoy played bass, Kenny Buttrey on drums, and Pete Drake on steel guitar. And they busted out this album in 3 days in the fall of 1967, which was several months after Sgt. Pepper. It was right around the time when psychedelic rock was starting to hit its peak. So Dylan, in true form, really, kind of just stuck to his guns, and he did his own thing. And that's the thing about Dylan. He never really let the times or, his fans or anybody else dictate what he should do next. He just did what he kind of felt was right for him to do. And this album was much more of a, I don't think it's as good as his other stuff. I think that this is where he starts to fall off and you start to see, subpar albums for him. But also I think part of the reason for that too is this is what happens with artists, right? You're young and you're pissed off and you have a lot of things to say, and you create amazing music, and then you get married and you have kids and you become boring. so Dylan kind of like, he started having kids around this time, and he kind of, started settling down, and, but for him, I think this album was something a little bit more that he wanted to do. He didn't want the record company, Columbia, to do any promo behind it. He didn't want to get back into the rat race, as he said. He didn't want to get back to the, to the spotlight. He just kind of wanted to make music. And he came up with an album. It's pretty concise, pretty basic. It does have, I think the standout track on this is not even because of a version he did, but All Along the Watchtower is on this, which became much more famous because of Jimi Hendrix about a year later when he recorded it. And I think that everybody pretty much, and I think people here would on this podcast would say that Dylan's best music was recorded by other people. But I think that that's certainly one of the songs that's certainly true. I mean, you can't compare them. But I knew a lot about this album. I didn't have to do a ton of research for it. I had to do some research on the dates and stuff. But but before we talk about the review of it, John, did you have any? You said this was the one Dylan album you never listened to, or the '60s album that you weren't familiar with.
I'll be very honest. Historically, Bob Dylan for me has been like taking my medicine, in that I can appreciate his artistic endeavors. I can understand the appeal of sort of the literate style of lyrics that he wrote, but I don't often connect with Bob Dylan in that voice of a generation style. So there you go. A little bit of my bias right there. I know you mentioned that you said, some people here are going to say that Bob Dylan's best work is writing for other people. I definitely am. I don't know where Josh stands on that, but that certainly applies to me in this case. And yeah, of course, this album features pretty much Exhibit 1A of that theory, All on the Watchtower, as Matt mentioned before. I'll kind of get into like what I noticed about his lyrics a little later, but I would say this. I think that this album, what stands out to me right away, the bass lines. Did you say
yes,
Charlie McCoy? Holy cow. I was not expecting bass lines in Dylan albums to be this good. And It really stood out. It was excellent. And that was the A1 thing that I noticed on this album. And quite frankly, the singing by Bob Dylan was more crystalline and clear than I'm used to,
Yes.
Compared to both albums before and after that I'm more familiar with. I will say that the album for me was sort of like a sandwich, in that there were two reasonably satisfying pieces of bread, the front end of the album and the back end, and then a very unsatisfying filler of the sandwich. Because I think in the middle of the album, this album really dragged. And, it kind of drug itself out of it a little bit toward the end. But that's sort of my quick take right there on this album. But I'm interested to hear what Josh has to say.
Yeah, it definitely sounded... I mean, I'm familiar with Dylan, obviously, through all of his, famous albums, but I've never really dug deep into the order of things, and what albums were where in his chronology. And I found this a really enlightening listen. I appreciated kind of almost like the stripped down nature of it in a way. I like the country. I guess I did find this album more country than maybe the Townes Van Zandt album was. And I enjoyed that as well.
Yeah, and I think the bass, I definitely saw that more. I mean, I've had this album for a while. I can't remember. It's for many years. I've known about this album and I've listened to it. It's never been something that it's been one of my first go-tos with Dylan. I think that a lot of this kind of does blend together for me as well. I see what you're saying too about the beginning and the end, John. I think I might agree with that to some extent. But it does show, and I would say even there's other albums that Dylan has, like National Skyline stands out, that if you listen to that, that's basically Dylan doing a country album, and his voice. That's the rag that Dylan gets, right? People hate his voice. I love his voice, and people are like, oh, he's got a terrible voice. I'm like, no, he doesn't. He's got a great voice for what he does. He doesn't have the traditional, a choir voice, or like, he doesn't have the vibrato and the clean, crisp, nature of a voice, but he's got a unique, distinct voice that many other, musicians and rockers do. And
Now,
and I love it. If you love Dylan's voice for certain albums, you'll love that. But you're right, John. It's a little bit more subdued on this, and it's a lot more subdued on Nashville Skyline for sure.
and I would say I fall in that category of I do not hate Dylan's voice. I do not love Dylan's voice, but I look at his voice as a piece of his music, but it doesn't ever turn me off of him, I guess would be a good way to describe it.
Yeah.
I don't think that it's an impediment for me to like him. But yeah, I kept writing over and over again on this album. Gosh, I even wrote up over these bass lines. Good stuff. It was as much as this album, I felt a little flatter on this album. I did listen to it directly after the Townes Van Zandt album, and I did that on purpose to kind of draw a comparison because I think they were a little bit in the same lane. It's just very funny because Josh mentioned before he felt it was, we flipped on the Townes Van Zandt album in terms of him viewing his folk and me viewing his country. I felt the exact opposite about this. I felt like this was still very much grounded in folk and that middle America folk hero narrative that, Dylan really revisits a lot in his early work. And it was very interesting to juxtapose the lyrics of Dylan and the lyrics of Townes Van Zandt. And, I give examples, but I don't want to suck up all the air here from you and Josh. But if you ever want to go there, I've got some things that I pegged that do show a little bit of what I'm talking about there.
Yeah. No, but I think overall, I mean, I do like this album. I do bust it out every now and then, and I think it's kind of just, and one of the things I love about Dylan is just, I'm going to do my own thing. And this is like, this album came out right at when psychedelic rock was the main thing, or was becoming the main thing. And he was like, I'm done with the spotlight. I'm done with, I want to go in seclusion and do my own thing. And that's just what he did. So, I mean, I think one of the things I love about Dylan is that kind of integrity, or, that he just kind of, he marches to the beat of his own drum, so to speak. And, and this was definitely a pretty palpable, example of that. But I would recommend it, I guess, for people that are interested in learning more about Dylan. It's still a good album. Dylan's got plenty of bad albums. Don't get me. I mean, there's plenty of albums that I would say stay away from, but this would not be one. And I think it's kind of interesting because when I first heard this album, I never heard his version of All Along the Watchtower. So that was the first for me. And I was probably in my 20s, and I was just like, whoa, that's what it sounded like, because nobody ever hears that version, it doesn't exist. It's always Hendrix. So, if you're interested in that history, or just exploring a little bit more about Dylan, it's pretty solid. And, I don't know if I don't have a rating for it or anything like that, but, I love Dylan. I don't say very many bad things about him because he's freaking Bob Dylan, man. Jeez.
So maybe this is like mid-tier Bob Dylan for you or something?
Yeah, I'd say definitely mid-tier for sure. Yep.
Yeah.
And if you were a non-Dylan enthusiast like me, I would say there's a lot of albums in the 60s you'd want to start with ahead of this one. It certainly is not a bad album, but Matt's already dropped two album names right off the bat that were right before this that he was touring off of, that I'd say start with those before it if you want the novelty of what Dylan sounded like as an early artist. There's that. I think that this one, if you find that you like Bob Dylan, you're going to like this album. If you're neutral on Bob Dylan or not a fan, I don't think this album's going to turn you over. I mean, it is a great list. All on the Watchtower is, and not just because of what it is the very clear best song on this album. The only other song that I think is in the ballpark is Dear Landlord. Those would be the two that I think stand out as the best two songs for me. But I would say that if you're a Dylan person or you want to deep dive into Dylan, you're going to like this album. If you're kind of on the fence, you can do better.
Yeah, listen to the famous albums, and then maybe like intermediate studies would be this album in there somewhere.
I think this album to me is more interesting for the history, for the story. I just the whole idea of the motorcycle accident, him not recording or doing anything right around this time he stopped touring for like 8 years. And just the whole mystery of the accident and what he was doing and where he was. And I think that's all fascinating. And 1967, like he did those 7 albums before, I'd probably say would all be better than this one, for me. And, he did those within 5 years. He did 7 albums in 5 years that are like amazing, you know. So
And
I think it's a great story.
I don't want to trot into this because this is gonna be something thematically that I'm gonna bring up in future episodes. But if you tend to view a lot of rock in the '60s as a response to things the Beatles did, which is a lot of how I view rock in the '60s, and the more albums you listen to, the more you start to see it. One thing that is unique is those artists that seem to not be, moved by what the Beatles did. And I would not say that Bob Dylan wasn't listening, but yes, that Matt did make an excellent point in that Bob Dylan was not listening to Sgt. Pepper or Revolver and figuring out, okay, how do I do my own version or get moved there? He sort of operated in his own world detached from it. And there aren't many artists, especially in the late 60s, and I don't really want to go into this too much because we'll talk about it later, but who sort of reside in that. I mean, Jimi Hendrix would be another person I put in that category. So they really stand out to me, the people that are not sort of taking their cues from the Beatles. And it's who wouldn't take their cues from the Beatles? I mean, they were doing groundbreaking stuff.
They weren't. He wasn't Brian Wilson for sure.
Yes, and he wasn't. And then there's of course the argument of whether or not Brian Wilson is the greatest defender. I'd say he actually managed to usurp them. But we've got plenty of time to talk about Pet Sounds and all kinds of Beatles albums down the road. So
yeah, I think we'll see them.
Yeah, they're on there.
Yeah.
So, I guess my final thought is what Matt said, or we're building off of that the context is everything. I think we'll find that as we listen to these albums, and knowing the influences or who their contemporaries were at that time is always important, like you said with the Beatles. And it always is more a rewarding experience when you hear those details about like the motorcycle accident, and it makes you appreciate the albums and brings them out in a different light.
If you're interested in hearing my long form version of why I like Townes Van Zant's lyrics more than Bob Dylan's, feel free to shoot us an email. I'd be happy to share things along the way. But we won't go there because we don't want this to delve into our